Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency are making headlines about massive cuts to USAID, including huge cuts to billions of dollars in funding to evangelical organizations that have taken in billions of dollars for decades, particularly overseas. And those funds are in serious jeopardy, but not all is as it seems for the religious right, which for decades has been working to undermine and erode the separation of church and state in America, allowing itself to reap those profits. And while it looks like that funding and that lifeline for the evangelical community is in jeopardy, at the same time, the religious right has never been stronger. The right-wing Christian nationalist network that fueled Project 2025 and powered Donald Trump's path to victory has plenty of power today. And I am so thrilled to be joined here on Court Accountability and Legal AF on the Midas Touch Network with the great Professor Marci Hamilton, one of the nation's leading scholars on religion and the First Amendment, a great champion of the Establishment Clause, the very in jeopardy Establishment Clause, to talk about the dynamics here. Of course, we've got a far-right, ultra-conservative majority on the Supreme Court that is barreling ahead with that erosion of the separation of church and state, and a new bill in Congress through which it seems like the religious right has a real chance to further entrench its stranglehold over American government. Professor Hamilton, thank you so much for joining us. You wrote an amazing op-ed recently about these USAID funding cuts and the cuts to the evangelical programs overseas, but not all is as it seems. Can you give us a breakdown of what is going on and sort of how we got here with the religious rights control of so many of the levers of government power in 2025 America?
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is such an important topic. So let's start kind of at the beginning here. How the heck did we get to the point where white evangelicals, and we have to be very careful here. We're not just talking about Christians as a generic label. We're talking about white evangelicals and conservative Catholics. How did they team up together and become so powerful to the point that they now have a voucher bill in Congress that would fund directly from government coffers to religious coffers, religious education? The short answer is Paul Weyrich, who was a strong Catholic political activist, one of the co-founders of the Heritage Foundation, combined with Jerry Falwell. Now, Jerry Falwell, of course, was the moral majority. He got a taste of political power and apparently really enjoyed it. At one time, he would publicly say, as evangelicals, they wanted nothing with government funding. It was corrupting, and they wanted nothing to do with politics. And he was reflecting our framer, James Madison, who said exactly the same thing in the Memorial and Remonstrance. But Falwell changed his tune. Once the federal funding sluiceway opened, he was right at the head of the pack. But at the same time, Paul persuaded him and other evangelicals to be against abortion. They were not in opposition to abortion before the mid-1980s, but the temptation for power, for political power, was too much to resist, and they became partners with the Heritage Foundation and other groups. And right now, what we have is the playing out of the mid-1980s to now. We're talking 40 years of intentional destruction of the separation of church and state, to the point that it looks like the Supreme Court this year could actually hold that a Catholic charter school is constitutional.
And so I'm glad you brought up that case, because this is the case they've been waiting for, that they have building up for, through the years, incrementally eroding this important separation of church and state. We've seen this tension between the Establishment Clause, which prohibits government laws respecting the establishment of religion and the free exercise clause. And the religious right and the lawyers of this right-wing legal movement have been using the free exercise clause as a cudgel against the establishment clause. What can you break down some of the steps that they have taken to now put us in a position where, as you note, the framers would have been, I think, appalled and shocked at the idea that we would have direct government funding of religious institutions, which seems all but certain to be the outcome of the Oklahoma case that you reference.
So let's just start with the Madisonian baseline. What Madison said, literally, not one penny ever should go from taxpayers to support religious education, because it means you're co-opting taxpayers to support faiths they may not agree with. But what we've landed on now is this very ugly grab for power and wealth from a concentrated group of far-right religious believers. It's a combination of white evangelicals combined with conservative Catholics, combined with Opus Dei and other cult-like groups within these religious organizations. The reason we got here is because of a trick that Professor Michael McConnell, once a judge, and really David French of the New York Times and Alliance Defending Freedom, the Beckett Fund, and others. What they did was they came up with this theory, and the idea was that it's unfair to keep government funds from religion. It's discrimination. You're being mean to our religious group. So we had a case in Virginia, and you had a proselytizing religious group, Awake, that wanted University of Virginia funds as a student group. And the University of Virginia said, no, under the separation of church and state, we can't fund your primarily religious activity. They were going out to get more believers and to sit with them and pray. Michael McConnell argued to the court, it's just so unfair that you would not give them money if everybody else gets money. David French made this argument repeatedly in the courts. So instead of treating religion as a potentially dangerous, tyrannical part of society, as the framers did, we were then treated to repeatedly now these arguments that if anybody else gets money, religion has to get it as well. And that's why we're talking about public funding through a charter school for a Catholic school.
And, on its face, it's sort of, it's an empathetic argument, right? You can see how they've had success with it, particularly in the press and in terms of driving that narrative. One of the other cases we were talking about before we started taping was the Trinity Lutheran case from 2017, where, in sort of classic fashion, they found the most sympathetic plaintiffs you could possibly imagine, these little kids who, all they wanted was access to the state program that would have allowed their church to resurface the playground so they wouldn't skin their knees. And they were able to actually bring on board Justice Kagan and Justice Breyer to go along with that. And that sort of helped continue to open the door to this. And now they just seem to be blasting right through it.
Well, they do. And it's partly because of the attraction in our culture of being against discrimination. So once they claimed that the separation of church and state was about discrimination, as opposed to the separation of power between the two most authoritative structures of human existence, religion and the state, the world changed for us. And so that has been an intentional way to completely unravel the Establishment Clause so that it is an insult to religion. But what that means is that religious leaders on the far right, not the left, on the far right, have persuaded themselves of two things. They should be the leaders in line to get government funding for anything they want to do. And number two, they should not have to obey the law. And if you put those two together, what we're talking about is a pathway to establishment of a religious worldview, and they have every intention of pursuing it. One of the things that really sticks in my craw is the stupidity of the argument that the separation of church and state is not in the First Amendment because it doesn't use the word separation. But what the American people need to be reminded of is it was the Baptists that coined that phrase, separation of church and state. And that's because they were being killed and marginalized and taxed in Massachusetts by the Pilgrims and the Puritans for not baptizing their believers correctly. And the same was happening to Baptists. They died for not being part of the established church, but there's just this kumbaya of, oh, we were all Christian at the start. No, we weren't. No, we weren't. We've always been diverse. Diversity is the only thing that saved us.
And in this ironic way, this gross expansion of the free exercise clause to, basically stand in the way of any existent extant establishment clause now seems to be itself threatening religious freedom, right? Because we've got an ascendant theocratic strain of dominionist evangelicalism and integralist Catholicism with huge control at the Supreme Court, particularly the latter, that now seem to be enabling a world through which we're going to have total and dominant control of government institutions by people who truly believe that everybody should submit to their religious worldview. And then at the end of the day, there will be no free exercise of the religion. I sort of piecing that together now. Does that make sense? Is that sort of where we're headed?
Well, there's a double track, and I'm publishing a piece in the near future on this. There's a double track here. There's one opening up all the doors to funding. The second one is opening up the door to be able to argue the law doesn't apply to them. So they want it both ways. They want to say they get government funding because it would be discriminatory if they didn't. In other words, they're on the same footing as everybody else. But at the same time, under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in the courts, they're arguing that they're special. So everybody else would have to obey the law, but they don't have to. And that's why right now, under Title VII, an employer has the right to discriminate against LGBTQ in their employment because of who they are. We no longer have protection of LGBTQ because any employer can claim a religious belief that they don't approve of LGBTQ and kick them out. So we have reached a moment where civil rights are caving in, where lawlessness is at the very forefront. And this has been encouraged by the likes of Professor Michael McConnell and Professor Douglas Laycock. This has been the intent from the beginning. Now, I think it's gotten out of their hands, but that doesn't absolve them of what they have been building for the religious right all these decades.
And how do you see the relationship between these elements of the religious right? I think probably best distilled in a figure like Russell Vogt, who describes himself as a Christian nationalist. This is the director of the Office of Management and Budget. Very important. He's implementing so much of Project 2025, acknowledged as one of its key architects. And Doge and the new right kind of Musk contingent that is kind of breaking government. How do you see these forces working together at odds in this very dynamic moment, in kind of constitutionally unsettled moment? How do you see all of those dynamics at play?
Well, so with respect to Christian nationalism, they really have persuaded themselves of fully false history, right? They are telling the American public that we started as a Christian country. Number one, that's a lie. We started as a Christian, Jewish, Muslim country living next door to Native Americans. There was never 100% Christians, but the Christians who were here were in multiple sects that disagreed, sometimes violently, with each other. So we had, the only Catholic established colony was Maryland. They weren't welcome in other colonies. Even the Quakers excluded non-believers from some public service in Pennsylvania. So what the American people needs to understand is we have always been a collection of believers. It's never been kumbaya, a bunch of Christians. Number two, Americans need to understand that Christians who are not part of this far right movement need to speak up. They need to say, I am Christian. I believe in abortion. I am Christian. I believe that the country should not be funding religious schools. And it is the failure to do that and to accept this mantle called secularism, when in fact many millions are also religious, that has given all this power to the religious right. They say they're on the hill. They are better than everybody else. Everybody else is just a sinful secular person. But in fact, there are many, many more in this United States who are religious believers who disagree with them. And I do hold the media to account for that. I think that the use of the phrase Christian has been way too loose. But what do I see about the intersection between Musk and the religious right? Frankly, it's pretty clear he couldn't care less. He doesn't care whether it's the religious right or anybody else. My diagnosis at this point of Musk is that he is lazy and has a goal. And the goal is to dismantle the government because that's what Trump has empowered him to do. But he doesn't want to do it by learning what works in the different departments. He's just going to do it according to algorithms. And so instead of doing the hard work of figuring out efficiency, fraud, and waste, he's just using his algorithms and his computer to say, you go, you're gone, get out of here. And oddly enough, that means all of the watchdogs are being removed. So USAID, sure, it was probably going to be in the crosshairs of that kind of reasoning. What I think everyone needs to understand is that showed a chink in the armor of the religious right. They can't control Trump. So if Trump chooses Musk over them, they will lose. At the same time, it was only 2 days later that Congress, the Republicans, introduced this massive voucher bill that would cost the American public $5 to $10 billion a year, and that would open the door for tax dollars, including at the federal level, to religious schools with no breaks. So for those who think that we have lost the separation of church and state, it's because we have. But, I have hope in my students still think, my fabulous students at University of Pennsylvania, both undergrad and law students, still believe the separation of church and state does and should exist. And what we've got to persuade the American people is it's being decimated. And unless we change course, we're in trouble.
Yeah. And to cast aside this American exceptionalism that leads us to this belief that it could never happen here. It's happening here right now. And I think what you said is so poignant, right, about the importance of faith leaders standing up against this. And it's what we've seen in authoritarian experiences internationally, even domestically throughout this country's history, is that when these pillars of democracy come up under attack, we need to come together across our differences and stand up for foundational values. And it's interesting, I think you're right. Like Musk clearly is motivated by something very different. But and you can see it in all of these examples that you've woven together so beautifully for us today, which is that, this destructive agenda that he is advancing in some ways very much serves the long-term trajectory of the Christian nationalist agenda. And you can sort of map it to the seven mountains of the seven mountains dominionist playbook, right? It's media and education and government. I can never keep all seven of them in my head. That's a long list. I think our brains are wired to hold like threes. But,
On a good day.
It calls for, right, the sort of, and education is such an important example of this, and the huge cuts to education. We had somebody from NEA join us recently to talk about this plan to destroy the Department of Education, voucherize education, and leave this vacuum into which these forces hope to, fill that space and take control. And unless we find that common ground, and lock arms and stand up against it. I think we are in great peril. So, Professor Hamilton, thank you so much for your wisdom, for your expertise, for speaking out so boldly, and with your decades of wisdom and experience to help educate folks about this stuff, because it's all wrapped up in centuries of American history and context and manipulation of the Constitution and law by these forces that I think are really hard for folks to grapple with without this type of translation. So really grateful for your time and for your work.
Oh, thank you so much. The only thing I would add is this is a minority that's trying to take control of the majority. 90% of American children are in public schools. So what we're seeing is an attempt of educating 10% to take control of the other 90%. That's what should send you screaming with your hair on fire out the door. It's scary.
Please don't forget to like and subscribe our channel here at Midas Touch Legal AF. So glad, again, Professor Hamilton, to have you join us. Would love to have you come back as these cases proceed through the courts. I know that Oklahoma case is scheduled for argument toward the end of the term, but things will heat up for sure, and we'd love to have your insights as things proceed. Until next time, signing out.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.